In this video, we're going to cover PlayStation emulation on the Xbox Series X and S versions of Retroarch. PS1 emulation is really special to me. It has a really big influence on the growth of my channel, and the PS1 was just friggin' awesome. It's still my favorite Sony console release to date, and has just so many awesome games. That being said, PS1 emulation on Xbox Series X and S kinda has some hit and misses. On the accuracy front, you can use Beetle PSX and have a very authentic PlayStation 1 experience. Unfortunately, the hardware renderer for Beetle PSX doesn't work on Series consoles yet. So we are limited to software-only mode, which means that if you like to upscale, you will run into some performance problems. The Beetle PSX core also only runs games from USB, so if you're a purely internal install, Beetle will not work and you cannot get that really accurate PS1 emulation. But if you do want to upscale and run your games from the internal drive, you have Duckstation available, which is a newer PS1 emulator. Not quite as accurate as Beetle, but it will do well enough to get the job done for most everyone out there. And this one does have a proper hardware renderer and will let you upscale pretty well as run games from the internal Xbox SSD. So we're actually going to do two setup guides today. One for Beetle PSX for those of you out there like me that don't mind the inability of upscaling. I like accurate PS1 games, so not upscaling isn't a big deal to me. And one for Duckstation, so you can see how to do it all internally as well as get that upscaled image if you so choose. So let's go ahead and dive in. To get started with PS1 emulation on your Xbox Series X and S consoles, you need to install the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. This guide is a continuation of my how to install Retroarch for Xbox Series X and S guide, so refer back to that video for initial install and extra settings to set before continuing on with this video. Link will be in the description or upper right hand corner of the video player. Once you have Retroarch set up and installed, we need to find some PlayStation 1 BIOS files. And depending on what region of games you want to play, you might need a couple of these. So if you want to play Japanese games, you need an SCPH 5500, US SCPH 5501, and for Europe, SCPH 5502. If you happen to own a PlayStation Classic, you can easily get these BIOS files from it using AutoBleem. I have a video on my channel showing you how to do it. If you have an original PlayStation, I also have a video showing you how to dump an original PlayStation's BIOS using a modded PS1 and modded PS2. The PS Classic version is way easier to do, so that is the one I would recommend. Or, alternatively, you can resort to the shady parts of the net and get them that way, but don't ask me for download links, because that's illegal, and I won't do it, so stop it! But once you have these BIOS files sourced, we just need to add them to our Retroarch system folder. So if you followed my advanced settings guide on my how to install Retroarch video, you might have created a file share going directly into your Xbox. So you can open this up, go into your Retroarch folder, find the system folder that you made, and then just drag them all right inside. Or if you are still relying on My Files Explorer, you can pop in a USB drive into your computer, copy them all over, and then over on your Xbox, you put the USB drive into it, open up My Files Explorer, navigate to removable storage devices, go into your USB drive, press start, and then copy over the BIOS files. And you have to do this for each one. You can't select multiple at the same time, unfortunately. So just press start on one, copy file, isolated storage, go up here to packages, find your Retroarch folder, it's usually the first one, go into the local state folder, and then find the system folder, and paste in the BIOS file. And then to do the additional ones, it's actually a lot easier. You just click on removable storage, simple, tell it to copy, and then you can press B, and it'll bring you back to the packages folder, local state folder, and you can paste them in. And once you have all those BIOS files placed, we're ready to move on to game prep. Next, you need to source some PlayStation 1 games. I do have a guide on my channel how to use the PC version of Retroarch to dump all of your CD-based games if you happen to have a large physical collection. Or, you could always do the shady parts of the internet again. I really don't give a flying crap which way you do it, but as always, just don't bother asking me for illegal download links, because I'm not going to give them to you. So, there we go. Yeah. Now, proper PlayStation game dumps come in the format of bin and queue. With this guide being for Duckstation, we don't really need to worry about if our games are in multi-bin format. So for example, my copy of Beast Wars has 2 bin files. Since we're putting these games on the internal Xbox SSD, that is just fine. We don't have to do a single thing with these games. You don't have to convert them, you don't have to do anything with them. All we need to do is access our development files file share if you set it up using the advanced portion of my setup guide. Go back into your Retroarch folder, go into that games folder you created and just dump them on in. Once the games have finished copying over, we are ready to move over to the Xbox. Alright, let's go ahead and get booted into Retroarch. Now, before we get started with playing PS1 games, there are a couple of changes we should make to our default Retroarch config file. So to do this, we're going to go down to Settings, and we're going to go down to User Interface. So press A here. And now we are looking for the Pause Content When Menu is Active option, and we want to turn this off. For some reason, with the Xbox version of Retroarch, disk changes on multi-disc PS1 games don't work right unless you have this option turned off. They fixed this on the PC version a while ago, but on Xbox it's still a thing, so we want to turn this option off. And once we have that set, we can just go back out to the main menu, go to the configuration file, and save the current configuration. We're ready to begin loading up our PS1 games. So one method of doing this is to go down to Load Content, navigate down to your S drive, this is where your games are going to be stored on the internal SSD, Program Files, Windows Apps, your Retroarch folder, your Games folder, PS1 Games folder, and then you could choose a game and tell it to run, and you will choose the Duckstation core to do so. So, right there. I don't personally like this method a whole lot, it takes a little bit longer, so what I like to do instead is make a games playlist, and to do this you just go back out to the main menu, scroll down to Import Content, Manual Scan, Content Directory, find your PlayStation Games folder, so again they're going to be on the S drive, Program Files, Windows Apps, Retroarch folder, Games folder, PlayStation Games, and tell it to scan this directory. For the system name, press right on your D-pad to go down to Sony, and find PlayStation. And then for the default core, we're going to press right on the D-pad to go down to Sony again, and we're going to find Duckstation. Now, PlayStation games, again, come in bin queue format, so we want to set a file extension for the queue files. That way we don't have to worry about having multiple entries on our playlist. So press A on File Extensions, and type in CUE for queue. And once you have that, press Start. Make sure Scan Recursively is set to On. Do not have your games inside zip files, and start the scan. And once that scan's completed, you'll have a new PlayStation games list here on the left with all of your queue files listed. And then to start up a game, all you need to do is select it and tell it to run. And there we go, PS1 games up and running on the Xbox Series X and S version of Retroarch. Very nice. But now let's go ahead and talk about multi-disc games within the Duckstation core. So for this example, I have loaded up Chrono Cross Disc 2. Now when I tell it to do a new game, it's going to ask me to insert Disc 1. So to change discs, I just need to go into my Retroarch quick menu with the hotkey I set during initial setup. If you didn't set up a hotkey, you need to do so before loading up a PlayStation game. And once I'm in the quick menu, I'm going to scroll down to Disk Control. Press A on this, and then press A on Eject Disk. And now we're going to go down to Load New Disk, press A, and we're going to choose the queue file for Chrono Cross Disc 1, or whatever disk you need to change to. For my example, it's Chrono Cross. And then I'm going to tell it to insert the disk. And it will change over to Disc 1 and allow me to start up my new game of Chrono Cross. And there we go. With those out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the advanced core options available to us within Duckstation, because that is why you are all here. You want to see some of those more fancy options. So once again, we're going to go into the Retroarch quick menu, and this time we are looking for the Options tab. I went past it there. Fun times. And our first option is to choose a console region. It is set to auto-detect by default, which should be good for most use cases. If you need to manually set a region, you could do so here. You will again need those extra BIOS files per region if you want to use those. Next, we have fast boot. So if you don't like seeing that PlayStation startup logo every time you load up a game, you could turn this option on and bypass right into the game itself. Some games will break if you don't have that screen enabled, so if you had a game that worked with this off, but it doesn't work with it on, you will need to turn it off. For authenticity's sake, I like to leave it off. I like that logo, so there we go. Next is CD-ROM region check, leave this off. Next is CD-ROM read thread. This is on by default and I recommend leaving it on. Next is preload CD-ROM image to RAM. This option is mostly useful for people that are running games off of slow storage media, but the Series X and S aren't going to have that problem, so you don't really need to mess with it. Next, we have a mute CD audio option, so this will get rid of audio tracks that are in CDDA and XA audio for format. So if you want to stream a game but it has copyrighted music, you could try turning this on, see if it disables it, if it doesn't have an option in the game to do so. Pretty interesting option. Next, we have CD-ROM read speed up. So this will make it so your emulated CD-ROM drive will read PlayStation games faster. This will break a lot of things, so I really don't recommend turning it on, but it works for some games, others it doesn't. Test it out, see what happens. Next is CPU execution mode, and this is on Recompiler by default, and that's where you're going to want to leave it if you're going to be doing upscaling. You could change this over to pure interpreter, but that changes it to a CPU only mode, and at that point you might as well just be using Beetle. Next, we have CPU overclocking. So this will overclock the emulated PS1 CPU. So if there are PS1 games that have hardware-induced lag, you can increase this to try to overcome that. Good examples of this would be Tony Hawk 1, 2, 3. Tony Hawk in general is a great example for this feature. I like it. But you can overclock it to a staggering 1000%. Do note that this will break a number of games when you go too high, so typically I found that you get really good performance out of most games going up to 150 or 200%. Next, we have GPU renderer. This is set to hardware Direct3D 11 by default, and this changes the video driver in your Retroarch build to change over to Direct3D by default. And it actually works like it's supposed to, which is really nice, unlike PCSX2, Dolphin, PPS, SPP. So we didn't need to make a Direct3D 11 specific config file for this one. Very nice. But definitely recommend leaving this one on Direct3D 11. You could also change it to OpenGL if you wish. Direct3D 11 will be a little bit faster. Next, we have threaded rendering, and this is for when you change your GPU renderer over to software mode. Again, if you plan on using software-based rendering, just use Beetle. Next, we have internal resolution scale, and this is up-resing your PS1 games. Now, for the most part, you can up-res nearly every PS1 game, but there are a few examples where this will break your games. Dark Forces is one of those games. It needs to be run at native resolution, otherwise it just does not look right at all. But as you can see, we have a ton of different options available, so let's go for 9x, go full 4K on this sucker. Now, unfortunately, that does kind of break the aspect ratio on the Series X right now, or at least it does for me. It might fix itself if we were to change this, restart the content, but I'm not going to bother with that right now. But as you can see, we are now running PS1 games at 4K internal resolution, and it is absolutely stunning to see, and it doesn't drop a single performance hitch on the games that I've tested. Of course, some games might drop performance. I just haven't encountered any in the games that I own, so if you do start to experience lag due to the upscale, you could always drop it back down until you get solid performance once again. Next up, we have multi-sample anti-aliasing, so if you want to have smoother pixel edges, you could turn this on. It goes up to 32 MSAA, 32 SSAA, but honestly, once you increase the internal resolution this high, anti-aliasing just kind of becomes redundant. But you could set the option here if you want it. Next, we have true color rendering, and this disables dithering and gives us a higher color depth. I like to have dithering on, personally. I mean, if you want to have less color banding, you could turn this option on. So just as an example, this is what it looks like with it on. And this is what it looks like with it off. So you can see the dithering on Sarge here a little bit. You can see the checkerboarding that is happening on him, as well as the color banding at the top of his helmet. You can see how the colors just aren't blending together as well. Whereas if we turn it on, it blends together a lot better. So, I mean, personal preference on that one if you want to have authenticity to the PS1 experience or to make things look really better than they were capable of on the original hardware. Next, we have scale dithering. Leave this on. And our next option is to disable interlacing. So there are a number of PS1 games that would have 480i gameplay or menus. if you turn this option on, it will basically force those into a 480p mode. It doesn't work on all games, but it's cool to see on the ones that do, so try it out for yourselves on your 480i titles and see what you think. Next, we have force NTSC timings, and this forces PAL games to run at NTSC timings, so 60 FPS, basically. Doesn't work for all games, but for the ones it does, for all of you PAL region players, it's pretty cool. Next, we have force 4x3 for 24-bit display, and then we have chroma smoothing for 24-bit display. I like to enable this one, makes FMVs look a lot nicer, but it can also apply to some in-game color patterns as well, so I like to turn this one on. Next, we have texture filtering, and this is set to nearest neighbor by default, and this is honestly my favorite type of texture filtering. It gives everything a nice upscale while retaining a sharp output. If you want, you can set this to bilinear, Jink, XBR. These ones are a little bit more blurry, but try them out, see which one you like best. It's really going to be a personal preference on that one. I personally prefer nearest neighbor. Next, we have a widescreen hack, and this will force games to render in a 16:9 window. You may notice culling around the 4:3 edges in a lot of games, and it's just a really, I don't know, I've never been the biggest fan of widescreen hacks, but it can work wonders in some titles, whereas in others it just looks absolutely awful. And it doesn't really do anything for Army Men here, so it's kind of whatever. Try it out in your game, see what you think. Next, we have PGXP geometry correction, and this is such an awesome feature of PS1 emulation. So just as a quick example here, this is the reason I loaded up Army Men for my example. You go up to these buildings and you can see how the windows change shape, the roof changes shape as you rotate the camera. But when you enable PGXP geometry correction, it will perspective correct these textures to make it so that they look really good in most cases. So again, for Army Men, now that we've turned on that option, we still get a little bit of the banding, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was. And then we can also enhance this effect by changing some other options. So we have culling correction on by default and texture correction on by default. Leave those on. But we can also enable the depth buffer, the vertex cache, and then we could change the PGXP CPU mode. And then when we go back into the game, you can see that we have a lot less bending and blurring on these buildings. It still kind of does it when we get close, but from a distance, it looks so much better than it did before. Now, there are a couple of extra PGXP options down here at the bottom for some reason, and that includes Preserve Projection Precision and PGXP Geometry Tolerance. Both of these can help out in the appearance of your textures as you get closer to certain things. They can also cause some interesting visual glitches, like your ammo counter going behind the wall here, so do be aware of that. PGXP is a cool mode to mess with, but it can cause some really interesting visual glitches. So if you want to have the perspective correct textures, you could choose to enable those here or not again. But I'm not gonna lie, it's cool to see just how much it changes the way that geometry and texturing looks. Just look at that box here on the right as I turn it on and off with this option. Like, it does make a difference. Of course, it's also causing those graphic glitches over in the top part of the screen with the trees and distance details, so it's such an interesting feature. And honestly, this is a really cool feature. It is going to work on some games better than others. It's just, you're really going to have to see it on a game-by-game basis. Alright, so next up we have aspect ratio. So this will set the core provided aspect ratio. You can set this to a lot of different options here. So auto is game native. You can set it to 4:3, 16:9, 21:9 if you really want to stretch it out, 32:9. Just every option you could think of is pretty much in here. So I like to leave mine on auto or 4:3 personally. Games in this era were meant to be stretched to 4:3 by the display, so that's something I honestly prefer. Next, we have crop mode, and so parts of your PS1 games are actually being cropped out that were part of the overscan on old displays, and it is set to that by default. It's an okay option to have. Or you could turn it off if you don't want to have any of the crop, or you could crop all of the borders instead. So I'm actually going to turn mine off for the moment. And next we have downsampling. This will downscale the internal resolution you have selected to the native output resolution of your console. Can look really cool in certain instances, and we have two options available, box and adaptive. So try them out and see what you think. For the most part in Duckstation I like to leave it off, but I don't know, it can look cool in certain games, so give it a shot. Next we have load devices from save states, so if you have a certain game that you have different things set up for, you could turn this on so that way they will be loaded into the game when you load up a save state. Not an option I personally use. If you know you're going to need it, then turn it on. Next up we have a couple of memory card options. So the first one here is memory card 1 type, and this is set to separate memory cards per game. This is a good option to leave set like this, that way every game that you save is on its own memory card, you don't really have to worry about running out of space. And there are a couple of different options available. By default it's set to game titles, so that way if you have a multi-disc game it'll share the memory card between all of that game title. You can set it to game code, you can turn off memory cards, or you can have a shared memory card between all of your games just like an original PS1 console. Of course, then you have to worry about running out of space and things like that, but it could also be really fun for games like Metal Gear Solid, where you get the special Psychomantis bonuses for having different games saved on your memory card. But as an overall rule, I like to leave this on separate cards per game. If you do want to have a shared memory card, you could actually set that in memory card 2. You can have a shared memory card 2 between all games, that way you can save something to memory card 2 if you want to have it pulled up in a different game or something like that. Use single card for playlists, leave this on. And next, we're finally going to get into some controller options. So first up, multi-tap mode, you can enable this on port 1 or 2. And then we could choose our controller 1 type. This is set to a digital controller by default because that's what all PlayStation 1 games were built to work with, because Sony didn't have a DualShock when the PlayStation first came out. So you could set this to the digital controller or the analog DualShock if needed. Now, if you want to play in DualShock mode, that should work for most things, but there are some games that don't enable analog mode by default, and you will need to force that on in a reset. So if your game doesn't change to analog by default, turn this option on and reset it, and it should work. And then just as a note, there are games that will not work with DualShock enabled, so you will need to set this back to a digital controller for those. But if you still want to use the thumbsticks to control them, you could turn on use analog sticks for D-pad in digital mode, so you can enable this to still use the stick to control the game. It's just going to be fake analog. Then you could set an analog access scale here if you want. And then you can apply the same options to player 2. If you want to play multiplayer games, you do need to enable a second player's controller. If there isn't a controller enabled for player 2, they cannot play games. You also might need to make sure that a player 2 controller is identified in the port 2 controls of the control section. And then the same thing that applied for player 1 will also apply for player 2. Alright, moving on, we have display OSD messages. So I'm sure you've noticed as I've changed things, there's been messages down at the bottom of the screen. You could disable those here if you don't want to see them. Next, apply compatibility settings. Leave this on. It will keep you from breaking things too badly. Log level, you can change how things work in the log as the emulator is running. If you get crashes, you can read the log and see what might have caused those. Next, we have CPU recompiler iCache. For the most part, you're not going to need to mess with this, but if you have games that are running way too fast, you could try turning this on, and it should bring them back down to normal speeds. It also improves the accuracy of the emulation, so I like to leave it on by default myself. Next, we have CPU recompiler fast memory access. Just leave this alone for now. And next we have a bunch of display active offsets, so I'm just going to leave these alone. You don't need to mess with them, really, just don't worry about it. Next we have a couple of PGXP things that we covered earlier. Again, I don't know why they are down here instead of up with the other PGXP stuff, but it's kind of whatever. And then finally we have internal run ahead, and this will let you do a certain amount of frames run ahead, help improve input latency at the cost of performance. So give it a shot. You may need to drop your internal resolution down, but give it a shot. If you are susceptible to input latency, you could try turning this on and see if it helps you out. But that's going to do it as far as core options within Duckstation are concerned. If there are options you want to have set in certain games but not others, you could go up to manage core options and save those as a game option file. Alternatively, you can save a core override, so that way every time you load up a game within Duckstation, these are the settings that will greet you. But that's going to do it as far as PS1 emulation within the Duckstation core is concerned. Again, if you are really into upscaling PS1 games, this is going to be the core for you. But if you prefer accuracy, go check out my Beetle PSX tutorial, because that's going to give you the best accurate PlayStation emulation performance you can get on the Xbox Series X and S. As always, if you happen to have any questions, feel free to ask me down in the comment section below, and I will do my best to try to help you out. But now if you could all do me a huge favor, and please be sure to hit that like or dislike button, just depending on how much you like today's tutorial. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit that sub button so you can see when new videos like this go live. Goes a long way to helping out the growth of the channel, and we are super grateful to all of you for that. If you'd like to further help support the channel, you can also check out that join button here on YouTube or the Patreon link in the bottom right hand corner of the screen. A little goes a long way to keeping this place up and running, and we are super grateful to all of our freaking champions who have done so. Y'all have been killing it the last 2 months. We are super grateful to each and every one of you. Thank you all so much for keeping us going. Y'all are our champions, and you're friggin' rock stars. But that's going to do it for this one, so until next time, my wonderful internet peeps, stay awesome, and we will see you all back next video.